All right, welcome back, everybody. Very interesting panel coming up called the Cyber Threat Landscape, Latest Risks and Dangers. And if you notice, one of our people on the screen is none other than John Stark. So if you're here this morning, I mentioned that my co-organizer and good friend John Stark, and more importantly, our MC, was not going to be able to join us, but John is back. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Bruce. Yeah,
let me just give a quick introduction for John, then I'm going to drop off and let him handle the intros from here.
Make it quick.
Know John for over 30 years since our time in the SEC Enforcement Division together. He's been doing IR for most of his career, starting with 11 years as founder and chief of the SEC's Office of Internet Enforcement, then 5 years as the DC office head at Strauss-Friedberg, and then 20 years as an adjunct professor at Georgetown and Duke Law Schools teaching cyber law. Now he has his own consulting firm, John Reed Stark Consulting. He's written hundreds of articles on cyber and incident response and is truly a world-class cyber expert, but probably a better MC. John, it's all yours.
Hey, thanks, Bruce. Good to be here. I can't believe I had to miss half this day. I went into the hospital for a back issue and I couldn't get out of there, but I just got out. Here's my thing, and I am here because this panel is unbelievable. I've been listening to them chat. I want to tell you that you just never get this kind of brain power together in one spot. So hopefully the day's been going well. I haven't been able to watch it, but let's get started. So just to introduce these people, just to give you an idea of how amazing they are. First off, Ashden Fein, a partner at Covington and Burling, vice chair of the firm's cybersecurity practice. What makes Ashden a cyber expert is not just that he advises a broad range of corporate clients on cyber, national security matters, crisis management, IR, risk management, governance, everything else, and regulatory compliance. Not that, but he's also served as a military intelligence officer and later as a lawyer in the JAG Corps, culminating as the chief of the criminal division for a command of 17,000 soldiers and as a legal advisor for an Army aviation organization deployed in Iraq. So he ultimately was the lead trial lawyer in the prosecution of Private Chelsea Manning for the leaks to WikiLeaks. So given the legions of foreign soldiers that wake up every day with the sole goal of infiltrating US systems and the fog of war characteristics of a ransomware attack, a national security expert like Ashden has become essential. Ashden is the real-life Ethan Hunt of incident response, and it's great to have him here. Welcome, Ashden.
Thanks, John.
You're welcome. Next up is Dan Greene. My friend Dan Greene, his bio is not going to tell you that he's a multifaceted IR litigation partner at Octillo, a firm that specializes in the juxtaposition of law, technology, and business. Sort of a new type of law firm that's been emerging, and their expansion across the country is really astounding. But what you may miss from Dan's bio is that before he joined Octillo, he helped lead a public sector venture capital investment portfolio, creating hundreds of jobs for high-growth startups. And then he joined one of the startups. This is an interesting specialty that no one else today probably has. Dan also leverages his experience to counsel some of the largest entities and fastest-growing companies in the cannabis industry, in the development of enterprise data security, privacy compliance programs, IRs, tabletops. He's got a real, even third-party vendor management. So this makes Dan, he might very well be the IR combo of Gil Grissom and Snoop Dogg. So we're real psyched to have Dan here.
I was wondering why he was so calm.
It's 4:20, so it's good to be here.
Okay, next up is Laurie Iacono. She comes from Kroll. She's an associate managing director in cyber risk there. Kroll has this expert network that spans the globe, bigger than just about any other firm out there. She's got unique cyber skills. Prior to joining Kroll, she managed the brand and consumer protection program at the National Cyber Forensics Training Alliance, leading a large team of intelligence analysts and strategic reports for that threat landscape. So she's really a threat landscape expert. And it's always, you got to have someone like Lauren to be on this panel. She's also a teacher, which makes her, for me, a cross between Dana Scully and Professor Minerva McDonald from Harry Potter. That's how I see Laurie. Very excited to have her. Welcome, Laurie.
I'll take it. Excited to be here. Thank you.
Excellent. And then, of course, the veteran, Dom Paluzzi, our next speaker, is going to tell you he's the co-chair of data privacy and cybersecurity at McDonald Hopkins. You'll read that in his bio. And he's one of the more seasoned IR practitioners that you'll hear from today. Don and his team at McDonald Hopkins have counseled clients through over 10,000 data breaches and privacy incidents. What you may not glean from his bio is he's really more than a breach coach. He quarterbacks the IR process for his clients. He's the ultimate IR thought leader with publications covering just about every IR subject. And one of my favorites of Don's pieces, he co-wrote about data breach vendor response, which is another specialization developing to help insurance brokers better understand IR best practices when their clients are impacted by a third-party cyber incidents. Covering what do you do when the vendor's breach, the steps you have to take, the questions. That's a very tough one. You get one of those silly notices. What do you do? What does it mean? So he's really one of the most experienced IR players we have here. He's Cal Ripken meets Lenny Briscoe. That's my friend, Don Paluzzi.
Thanks, John. Good to see you. Good to have you.
Yep, and following is Joe Santiesteban from Orrick. And I don't know if people have noticed, but Orrick has built up quite a substantial practice of cyber people. And I think, Joe, this is your first time at an IR masterclass?
As a panelist, yes, not as a attendee, of course.
Good, good. He's a specialist in some of the more esoteric cyber-related laws, such as navigating the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, the ECPA, the Federal Wiretap Act, and all their state analogs. He's also an OG cyber litigator, wrapped in this kind of IR clothing because he's worked some of the bigger cyber cases since our space began to develop. For instance, LabMD, he represented LabMD in its successful petition to the 11th Circuit, resulting in the first ever court decision overturning an FTC action. So this Orrick team, they're really everywhere in cyber litigation. They love to fight. They win just about every time. And that makes Joe the Conor McGregor of IR. So with this, happy to be here today and can't wait to listen to this panel. So thanks, everyone, and take it away, Dan.
John, thanks so much. I'm glad you broke out of the hospital to be here for these introductions. I got to talk to Bruce. I think we need another panel, just you going through the introductions that we missed from earlier today, because I would love to hear all the cinematic pop culture and literary references and comparative introductions. Just fantastic. So,
you got it. Take care, guys.
Yeah, it's all downhill from here, I think.
Exactly.
The intro was great. I'm just going to take that. Thanks, Conor McGregor of Cyber, going on the bio.
So it's great to be here. To turn over to the topic at hand, it is, again, the cyber threat landscape, latest risks and dangers. And this is one that is fairly evergreen across all of today's and this morning's other panels. We've touched on different trends, different new behaviors. And what we want to do here today is talk about what's that reoccurring new behavior that we're seeing that maybe feels different than just a one-off that's a little less frequent. And what does it mean? There are, of course, a lot of the same themes that we see throughout different types of compromises, but trying to speak to those trends. And we may look back in a year and say, yes, that topic deserves its own panel, or other things were just a blip on the map. But for today, we're going to start with some high level, what we see as trends, get into some pointed examples, and then talk about what I think is really important, and I know my panelists agree, which is responses to these trends. What are we doing in response to these trends? Because that is its own trend on this landscape. So to get us started, I'll turn to Laurie. What do you think of when you think of how to discern, those unique and novel new threats in this space, and what do you do to study it and point it out as something that is a trend versus maybe just a one-off? What's the number of times that something has to happen where it becomes a trend in your mind?
So the answer to that is everyone's favorite. It depends, right? So what I will say is, as John kind of eloquently said during the introduction, Kroll has, a lot of visibility. We have visibility into incident response cases. So like actual IR events that like an observed cyber attack. We also have visibility into like the MDR side. So, attempts at actors. So we're constantly trying to look at that information. And one of my jobs at the Intel team at Kroll is I curate a quarterly threat landscape report. So we're doing just that. We're kind of looking at all this data and trying to pick what are we reporting on. And sometimes we see things that, we need to report on them right away. We can't wait for the quarterly landscape, right? So there's a lot of work that goes into making those decisions, because we can't report on every single thing we see, because what we don't want to happen is that trend reporting becomes just noise for organizations. What we want it to be something that's actually helpful and actionable for our external audience. So I kind of picked there's maybe two scenarios that I would say we use for this. So there might be, something not entirely unique. So maybe something that from the marketing perspective isn't sexy, so to speak, but we see that it's happening at a high volume. So this might be, a particular sector is being targeted at a high volume. This might be something like exfiltration. We see that a lot. We've been talking about that for many years, but when we see it happening at a high volume, it's important to remind everybody that that's still happening and they need to look for it. The other scenario I would say is when we see something extremely unique and novel, that maybe it's only happened once or twice, but it's novel enough that we think we need to kind of alert people to it. And a really good example of that is earlier in 2022, kind of fall of 2022, we started seeing what we're calling now Google Ads abuse. So basically, there were these, Google Ads targeted at IT professionals when they would go on the site thinking they were downloading something like a legitimate tool or service. They were actually infecting their systems with malware. So, that was an example where we kind of saw a one-off, and we reported it. And then soon we saw multiple different groups kind of using that same tactic for initial access. So it was important that we got that trend out there early.
For everyone else on the panel, when you're talking to clients, they're responding to an incident. When does information become actionable for you as far as trends? And if not actionable, at least reliable to start talking to your clients through what you're seeing in other instances or what you're learning from Laurie and her team or other similar teams.
Yeah, I mean, I think in most cases, we're trying to gather as much intel as we can from all available sources as quickly as we can, because it helps dictate, what we may be expecting in terms of if it's ransomware, a nation state, what their motives are, what their TTPs are. So I think, any intelligence can be valuable, even when, it may not be defined enough to be a trend, but we're often working with our forensic providers and folks like Laurie, as well as, threat intelligence firms, FBI, ransom negotiators. You're really trying to pull all of that together to try to make some use of it, to give your client kind of right-sized advice.
Yeah, I exactly, to Joe's point, to Laurie's point too, right? I mean, an organization faced with a ransom demand, we want to bring as much intelligence to them, right? So that at the end of the day, while it's a business decision, right, payment and not, and we'll get into that later, but to have as much intelligence so that the board, the executive management, they're making an informed business decision as opposed to sort of blindly making that decision. Understanding extortion threats and percentage negotiation and all of those things. So it's our job as breach coaches and privacy counsel to bring the right folks to the table, and ones that maybe have seen the same thing over the last 2 weeks, right? As Laurie mentioned, we see trends in not only threat actor groups, but that entity type getting compromised. And we certainly see when it's, for instance, a public entity time, it's city after county after city after school, right? And so we see those trends and can help bring that additional intelligence to our clients.
Certainly feels like the duck that is, cool on above the water as they're helping a client, but then paddling furiously to make sure they're gathering all that market intel. And ransomware came up a couple of times there because I think it's such a perfect example of where studying all that data and that market intel can give us real insights to share with a client. But we do have this trend of fracturing across ransomware and more ransomware as a service. So Laurie, what does that mean to the study of the TTPs and to study of the different groups' activities? Because we have more maybe than ever, and we have more actions and more intel to study than ever.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things there. I mean, when it comes to the ransomware as a service infrastructure. We've kind of seen in the past few years, like there's probably kind of a few key groups who are running the big games in town. And even when we see one of them be disrupted, we usually see them come back with another name and another branding. Part of those operations, they have their affiliates working for them. So now we have hundreds, we're kind of force multiplying ransomware, right? Because we have all these distributors who are working for them. We know from things like the Conti leaks in 2021 that these groups put effort into training and documenting their procedures. So it's not just their affiliates that learn from them, but when they have these leaks on the dark web now, Joe Schmo, who's on the dark web, can go and get the Conti leak manual essentially and figure out a blueprint of how to get into a system. So we certainly see that from an attribution side. I think there is, a challenge right now because there is so much similarity between the groups and the tactics they're using. But I think that from, on that same token, because there is such a similarity between what groups are doing, I think it's important to study the tactics and knowing these tactics can help from a defense perspective. Because there's, a few themes I think that we see pretty standard, things like open RDP, obviously, unpatched vulnerabilities. Those are always things that they're going to go after. And like I said earlier with the example, the Google Ads abuse, once we saw that kind of in a one-off example, it wasn't limited to just one group that was using that. There were multiple different groups that were using that for initial access. So it's just kind of showing, like I said, maybe attribution is a little harder, but studying the tactics is beneficial for defense.
And it's been a busier time, especially in the beginning of this year, I think, as we've been touched on earlier panels, and we'll touch on here. So I should have maybe opened this to everyone watching with an apology that this might not help you sleep that well tonight. But if you have questions, please enter them into the chat and we'll try to address them as we're talking. Joe, on a broad level, when it comes to ransomware, where are we compared to 12 to 24 months ago as far as the risk to victims? Are you seeing them in a worse situation, a better situation? Reflecting on what Laurie just said, is it about the same, just different? What do you think?
Yeah, so I was talking about this with Dom, and I think it's unequivocally worse. And it's mostly a trend, I think, probably over the last 3 months that's probably most notable. So, if you look at the intelligence coming out and are consistent with our experience in early January, it was that, ransomware attacks themselves were down. Victims were becoming less reluctant to pay. There had been, increases on the security side as well, government pressure on ransoms as well. And so it was getting to the point, particularly for sophisticated businesses with a mature cyber program, the ransomware risk was reducing. Whereas what I think we see now over the past 3 months is an explosion in ransomware that's kind of back to 2020, 2021, with new kind of reconfigured threat groups using new cool means of getting access to systems, like Laurie mentioned, the Google ad poisoning, or seeing the other one really is the unpatched vulnerabilities, but they're just exploiting them very quickly. So a file share provider will announce a critical vulnerability, and it'll be exploited with ransomware within a week. So it's there's just a ton of threat actors. So definitely in a worse spot.
I thought that might be your answer, thus the warning everyone before we got into that question. And Dom, obviously on the other side of these compromises is often extortion in the ransomware space. There is extortion. So where are we seeing extortion evolving right now, and what are you seeing as far as the landscape on that front?
Yeah, Dan, it is fascinating to look back, over the years, and we went from encryption only events where, yes, we'd have a business continuity issue. Demands were very low. Sometimes we paid and we didn't hear back. Most of the time we did. Everybody goes off their merry way. It was the key would work. It would be a very simple restoration process. And then organizations started beefing up their backup strategies, right? And nobody was paying attention to threat actors. So a couple of years ago, this whole concept of double extortion. So now we have the encryption, but right before that, they were taking data. So even if you didn't need the key, right, they were sort of dangling the carrot over your head and saying, hey, we have this data and we're going to leak it to our site. And now we sort of have moved into this, well, exfiltration only, where organizations will come to us and they don't have an issue, business as usual. They get what looks to be like a spam email with a couple of driver's license and social security cards. And as we bring in the Krolls of the world and start doing some forensics, we realize, wow, yeah, they actually did exfiltrate a ton of data. They leak the name and then ultimately, right, threatening to leak all of that data. Had one last week where threat actor called employees and said, I'm going to read off your social security number to you and let me know if it's accurate. And of course they were, right? So organizations now are faced with we don't need a decryption tool. Nothing's even encrypted. Do we pay for data suppression, for that quote promise, for the threat actor to quote delete the data, to not share it, to not post it? And we typically will discourage that payment. We've seen too many organizations getting burned, right? Where they're paying and threat actor is still taking those steps or have already shared it with another group. We've had it recently where we paid one group, they didn't leak it, but another threat actor group who was involved in the true encryption or exfil came to us and said, hey, I didn't get my share of the pie. And now I want, a payment. So we have these re-extortion threats as well. So organizations are really faced with a very difficult situation. And as I tell all of my clients, and some of it comes to a surprise, we can't buy our way out of a data breach notice, right? If we pay, they don't post. Guess what? We still have to go through that whole process. And so for all those reasons, it's become a more challenging issue. It's real simple when you got to pay to restore and the company's life is on the line. It's very different when there's a threat of data and that breach has already happened. So very, very interesting discussions. For the most part, as while the ransoms and the extortion events have increased, the good thing is the ultimate payments have definitely decreased over the years. So I think we're trending right there, but the exfiltration only, we're seeing a real uptick in that.
Certainly, that idea that this is a marketplace where people have reputations and they want to be known as, not re-extorting or otherwise committing to their word and holding that word is eroding and evaporating around us, it seems, as we encounter the splintering of groups, the new approaches and tactics. But on the topic of tactics, I wanted to talk, Ashden, to specific trends, and we've referenced, open RDP and some of those favorites and, patch management. But are there more sophisticated attack vectors that you're seeing, certain trends that are worth noting of particular concern?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I'll say maybe not attack vectors. Certainly there are some, and I know others will discuss that. But when it comes to those attacks that might be targeting certain impacts, certainly seeing more incidents that are either intended to impact or just eventually impact organizations' operational environments and not just their data. So these are incidents that tend to have a greater impact on organizations because it impacts their capability to operate, especially in the operational technology, industrial control space, than just their data being available or, as Dom discussed just now, having data simply exfiltrated. So specifically, these incidents we're seeing are incidents that originate through either the client's technology supply chain, so supply chain-like attacks that may have a temporary or more sustained impact, or they're incidents that originate from sort of the same old type of infiltration or initial threat vector, but ultimately pivot into the operational either segmented or what clients think were segmented spaces. But regardless, these operational technology environments are at risk, and it really does change what we're seeing from organizations, like the way that they calculate their risk. It really drives their decision making in a different direction, considering the level of risk is much greater when they realize, for instance, they can't produce the product that they rely on the manufacturing site. They're connected systems can no longer communicate, so there might be safety or quality concerns. It's just the impact is very different and typically much greater. So I'll conclude with just two statistics from Dragos in their recently released 2022 report, their threat report in this space, where they saw an 87% increase in ransomware attacks against industrial organizations, and then a 35% more ransomware groups that impacted industrial control systems and operational technology. So that's what they were seeing in 2022, and we're seeing and hearing that from clients as well.
That is a great turn in not just the trends in ransomware, but the trends into other spaces. I'm sure our other panelists are seeing, it can reflect on not just that, but related non-ransomware trends. One thinking of in particular relates to macros and the use of OneNote. I want to pause in case anyone has thoughts on what Ashden just shared, or otherwise talk to Laurie about OneNote. So Laurie, when it comes to what else you're seeing out there, I've given away sort of the answer on this, but walk us through that trend, because it is sort of like a displacement of water, where we thought there was a momentary way to address this, and suddenly this OneNote issue immediately arose.
Yeah, so I think phishing is really interesting here and what we've seen over the last year, because phishing still, to me, when we do our initial access, looking at it every month, it's like, wait, phishing was the number one? Like, are you kidding me? Like, when you're in cybersecurity, you think, how could this be it? It has to be something more complex. But actors still use phishing a lot because it works, right? And I feel like this is a place where we've seen actors almost like using what I would call, like what we would call in business, like continual process improvement, right? That's almost what we're seeing the threat actors use when it comes to phishing. Because when Microsoft announced, last year about the mark of the web, like automatic macros would be restricted in untrusted Office documents, it was, kind of this win from the security perspective. But before it was even implemented, we started seeing threat actors start, changing what they were doing. And the initial change that we were seeing last year after the announcement was threat actors using what we would call kind of container files in phishing attacks. So like a .iso or a .lnk. These are files that most users would never need to use in their course of regular business, but they were using those to launch their attacks. And then to your point, more recently, what we've seen in 2023 is them pivoting to the .xml files from OneNote and leveraging those for phishing attacks. So now they're back to Microsoft Office products, just a different one that they're using. We're seeing, particularly with phishing, we're seeing a lot of QBot activity or QuackBot activity right now. They do seem to be working still with Black Box ransomware groups, so that's a frequent attack chain. We also, I know last year when we started seeing the phishing attacks evolve, another thing that we noticed was the attack chain was getting longer. So we've seen in phishing attacks, it's not just malicious document to infection. There's these multiple different steps now that actors are going through before the badness is actually launched. And it's, likely because they're trying to maintain undetected and evade detection on the system. So just, as I said, kind of showing how they're always trying to stay one step ahead of what we're trying to do in the security community.
And staying one step ahead seems to be where, again, there's a lot of different topics to talk to through here. So we're in ransomware. We've just discussed phishing. We've talked about compromises to operational tech environments and some ad poisoning. Joe, other either targets that you're seeing, specific industry targets, personnel targets, methodologies that also signify a trend to you?
Yeah, so I think there's a few, and again, it's the things that are not going to help you sleep better at night.
Yeah, but everyone just pile in, guys. Let's just.
So I'll start at the outside, and would be phishing, but specifically like more sophisticated phishing, targeting IT professionals, and using it for MFA bypass, in addition to getting them to download files. Once they're in, we're seeing them abuse more legitimate processes. So it's not as noisy along the way. And if you look back, what you'll see are alerts for activity that are rated as, a medium. And maybe the response team essentially along the way just, took an action to block something and hit resolve and didn't treat it as if they had a ransomware actor or nation state actor like in their environment, rather than there being some kind of screaming alert for Cobalt Strike or some other kind of tool that the threat actors like to use. The other one I would say is we're just finding new ways to deploy ransomware at scale without needing domain admin permissions. So whether that's, deploying ransomware like in a file application, like a file transfer application, or finding a way to deploy it within the environment without those elevated levels of permissions is another one that I think we've seen a lot of this year.
This is John checking out of the hospital made room for me so I can check in after we've gone through all of these topics. Quite a sweat-inducing list. Unless there's any others, let's talk over to responses, right? The trends that we're seeing, the things we're doing in response, for better or worse, what's working and what's not. Because there is always going to be new trends in the threats, but there also needs to be trends in the responses. Dom, to you, what are we seeing in updating training practices? What can be done, in training? Because it's, as Laurie noted, phishing still works, right? We're still here talking about phishing, and everyone groans and says, "I'll never fall for that email." And we're like, well, we wouldn't be having this conversation if it didn't still happen,
That would never happen here.
Yeah.
We have careers because that always happens. And, while we're keeping everybody up at night, the good thing is they can call us because we're all staying up at night right now, 24/7, not sleeping, responding to the hundreds of attacks. But you're right. We'll sit down with organizations, do breach response workshops, tabletops, and we meet with the technical team, and they all have their stuff in order. That's not really, for the most part, where we're seeing things go bad. It's the folks whose everyday job is not to worry about cybersecurity and data breaches, and they hold the keys to the kingdom, and the threat actors know that, right? They take advantage of LinkedIn. They know exactly who to target, and as a result, as Laurie mentioned, these spear phishing attacks are very effective, right? And we need to do a better job of training, and I know we'll talk a little bit later about some training fatigue, because I think that's out there as well. But the latest threats, right? Just keeping in mind that, again, the folks whose everyday job is not to worry about all of this are the ones that are really falling victim to it, phishing email after phishing email. And, multi-factor is another one, big misconception. We put that on and, all is well, and we're not going to need our services. Unfortunately, threat actors get around that, whether on the technical side of, still having the legacy protocols in place. Just last week, helped a large health system, multiple physicians, all had multi-factor on. Unfortunately, the green check mark and the red X came their way, and they all just pressed the green check mark, whether they were just, distracted in their everyday job. But some of them told me, hey, I thought it was my PA, and thought they were having to get in. So it's that sort of constant awareness that, hey, we may have all the technical safeguards in place, but we got to make sure we're training our folks. And one other ancillary to the last sort of topic is the third-party breaches. John talked about that a little bit because I've written a lot on this. We're still seeing a ton of that, and big misconception there, right? We have everything safe under our roof. We pass that data on to a third party, they have the breach, and we're still responsible. And we're seeing the regulators still go after the entities, even though they didn't have the breach. And we're seeing the litigation against those data owner entities. So we can have a whole other panel on third party breaches, but it does tie into making sure, for our information training, for the information that we're passing on to third parties, making sure we're vetting and appropriately auditing those entities, because they're causing huge liabilities for data owner clients.
Yeah, Dom, on that topic, are you considering adding or advising on new angles in that vendor auditing, or more frequency? I mean, it sounds weird to say that we need to train people on MFA, and yet if we are having these MFA issues, is that suddenly becoming a frontier we have to address?
Yeah, no, for sure. I think that, and then even on the third parties, we always walk a fine line. We don't want to audit too much of a third party, because then we sort of take on that obligation should we miss something, and that causes the breach. But yeah, I think the third party trend, the multi-factor fatigue, all of that's going to require a little tweak in what we normally have done in the past, both internally and externally.
And that, I think we're talking about, we hit that moment of diminishing returns. So Ashden, do you have thoughts as far as, what is too much security training, or what can be done in the security training space to either keep it fresh or make it, strengthen it and make it more responsive to the threats and the trends that we were just talking about?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I certainly believe pretty strongly that organizations can always improve their training. I don't know if that's being naive, or maybe it's my military background shining through, but many, if not most, organizations that have incidents tend to identify a inadequate training as being one of the contributors during postmortems. But unfortunately, there seems to be a trend that to solve that issue, it's to increase the amount of training, like adding more phishing exercises, add an extra module onto the annual information security training. Organizations should really consider increasing the quality of their training and not necessarily the quantity or frequency. We're certainly seeing a trend of tailoring. So here's some examples. Like, we're certainly seeing a trend of tailoring training to different constituents. So for example, clients may have generic training for the broad user base of the entire network, but different training for those that operate in the operational technology environments, or the carpeted area between the two. They may have specialized training for system administrators, human resources, or others that have access to, sensitive personal information, senior executives and their administrative assistants, supply chain folks, procurement, and maybe even like customer service reps. So, one solution is not for all, and the different types of risks for each of those areas or each of those types of constituents can vary greatly. So it's really tailoring it. We're also seeing clients in traditionally more cyber sophisticated industries constantly improve their training by either incorporating in their own present day risks. So it's not the same annual training. It's like, here's what we're seeing, and tailoring it through a risk-based approach, or incorporating in just real life case studies of what they're seeing in their networks, their domains, what their own colleagues are doing. So it really has a personal connection to the user base. So ultimately, the training seems to be moving for a lot of organizations from just the stock information security annual slug of a requirement to training that hopefully resonates with the users and really puts them on point to think about what they're doing on a day-to-day basis.
Great insights. And I can tell in part because not just the content, but the reactions from folks in the questions area. Ashden, your insights brought a couple of questions to the fore. And I think one is always helpful to hear. And it's, what are the magic words? What can we say? What are the talking points to executives, to leadership, to a board, to help them buy in on, improving training? Is there any such words, and what can we do on that front to improve it? Maybe it's not just headlines or having to sit and listen to all of us talk about all these threats all the day, but for Ashden, to start with you and then move on to anyone else's thoughts, I think that would be helpful for the crowd to hear.
Yeah, I'll start. So perhaps first, it's really just about the buy-in in the whole cybersecurity program. I mean, it's not only good business practice at this point. It's frankly, depending on the industry you operate in, the country you're domained out of, it's all but a requirement. So having that top-down approach to security. So I think, it could be as simple as a senior executives, publishing through a town hall, doesn't need to be an entire town hall focused on cyber, but having a few messages to say, information security is a major risk for our business, our core business, whether it is making a widget, producing this food product, providing this technology service, whatever it is. But really trying to get that buy-in. And if it's from the legal side, there are certainly some some regulatory compliance backing that could help message this to senior executives to sort of hopefully not necessarily wake them up, but make them more aware of potential liability that exists today or in the future. But really overall, security could be a differentiator. And it is somewhere where if you're protecting your systems, your people, your products, it's going to likely make you just a better business. So it's tone from the top really helps, I think, start or amplify training at the user level.
Yeah, a similar question from the crowd is, dealing with the SEC and then dealing with vendors and how to flow down SEC requirements to make sure that you're receiving notice in time to provide it. And at the same time, I think that is to your point where it's just good for business and the ability to attract clients. But I'll pause for Joe, Dom, Laurie, any follow-on thoughts from Ashden's perspectives on training?
I would say maybe two things. So first, and I think they are themes that Ashden hit on, but the first one is aligning to security to mission, vision, and values. And so from the legal perspective, what that means is partnering with the security team to deliver coherent messaging, like in cohesive risk messaging to executives, right? Oftentimes we see the security teams often reporting on their risks up the chain and the legal teams off reporting up on their risks. And executives don't really have a comprehensive view of risk in the security space. And so as a lawyer, I mostly run around touting like reducing security risk reduces the most legal risk. And, as Ashden kind of previewed, there are things we can bring to bear, whether that's Uber, the new SEC rules, the FTC's focus on executives. Like there's a lot that the legal group can do now to kind of partner and amplify the messaging of the security team.
Joe, while I have you, one thing we haven't talked about when we're talking about vendors and executives is also we're in a space where mergers and acquisitions, I think, are part of what all of our clients are facing or maybe considering, and along with vendors, and sort of looking at the threat landscape through the lens of entities that are potentially merging. How do you see those teams sort of reflecting on what you just said? Trying to put their best foot forward in order to reflect that they have that mission, those values, and at the same time, be honest brokers with where things stand in their program and the threats they're facing and the way they're responding to them.
I think that's one of the hardest things, and it's part of this broader trend that we've really been talking about, which is as businesses mature their kind of core cybersecurity practices, the potential gaps are, OT. Or certain OT-like infrastructure, or a recent acquisition that just has been connected to the domain but hasn't quite been brought up to snuff yet, right? And so this is, one of the big challenges for particularly like fast-growing tech companies, a lot of companies I work with. I would say a couple things is, and we see them kind of acting like cyber insurers, really. And so it's doing accurate risk assessment at the beginning, finding opportunities for those kind of like big wins on the basics from cybersecurity perspective. So focusing on keeping systems up to date, getting MFA out, getting EDR rolled out, those kinds of things. And then again, the tone at the top, like for the entire organization, it has to come from executives that cybersecurity is going to be a priority, or else it's really not going to go anywhere.
Well, I think we made it through maybe 2/3 of our agenda for things to talk about today, guys. So thanks for all your thoughts and for the questions from the group. Bruce, before I turn it back over to you, just any last closing thoughts, big ideas or takeaways for those listening? Joe, I'll start with you.
Wait, sorry, I didn't hear that. Is it
Put you on the spot, Joe. That's my bad.
My takeaway: reducing cybersecurity risk reduces legal risk most of the time. The most legal risk most of the time.
Dom, your thoughts?
It's never too early to have that discussion. Would we ever pay a threat actor? If not, read an article today, a hospital is getting sued because they're by a patient who's forcing or trying to force them to actually pay to get their pictures taken down. I mean, it's a never ending battle, and have the discussion now while things are calm.
Laurie.
Yeah, so I'll say, I mentioned earlier about the threat actors, continual process improvement, right? Like that's what we need to do as organizations when it comes to the security front. And I think that threat intelligence is a really important key to that. So paying attention to the reporting that's coming out on these trends is really helpful to help organizations improve processes.
Excellent. Ashden?
Sure. Legal and technology teams should just partner soon and often.
Sage wisdom from this panel. Thanks, everyone. Bruce, back to you.
Hey, thanks, Dan. Great panel. Really appreciate everybody's insights today. We will be back at 3:30 with a panel on post-cyber attack data privacy compliance. We'll see you then. Thank you.